Hey, and welcome back to my program. I wrote a column this week. Hope you'll take a look at it. It's on our website at www.jimbrownusa.com. And wrote about former President Richard Nixon. 40 years ago this week, Nixon resigned because of the Watergate scandal, and it was a scandal, and he should have resigned. It was a terrible decision for him to tape record every statement that he made in his office. Interestingly enough, he started this about the second year of his presidency. I think the day before that he did these recordings, Elvis Presley came to the White House to visit the president. That's not all in the recordings. We'd like to hear that conversation. In any event, he recorded all these conversations that eventually came back to haunt him. And when he was forced to make these tapes available by a Supreme Court dominated by his own appointees, then it put the coup de grace in to where it was shown that there was a cover-up. He did encourage Haldeman and several of his key operatives to obstruct justice involving telling the FBI not to investigate. Terrible decision. I think, though, in the scope of things, it didn't do fair justice because he was so tainted. History looks on him as the only president to ever resign from office. Wasn't impeached. He would have been impeached. But it covers up or puts aside all the good things Nixon did. He's a pretty good president, particularly in the area of foreign policy. Nixon was the first president to go to China, realizing that a bond with China, that a relationship with China was so important for peace in the world, as well as economic development between the two countries. He was a visionary in that regard. When it came to domestic issues, the segregation, for example, when Nixon took office, 10% of the schools in this country, particularly in the South where I live, were integrated, only 10%. 70% were by the time he left office. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, National Cancer Institute. A number of things that Nixon did were very good for the country and helped the country tremendously. So he's not been given that due. And I'd share a couple of personal stories, which I did in my column about Nixon. I met Richard Nixon the first time when I was in law school back in 1966 at Tulane University in New Orleans. I was the president of my senior class. As a consequence, I arranged speakers to come to the school, trying to get important speakers who could give us some information and touch base on national, international issues. Well, Nixon, you might have recalled, was defeated for president in a very close election. Some people think that it was stolen in Chicago when about 10,000 votes would have made a difference. Goes back to a fascinating story involving then Mayor Richard Daley and how precincts didn't come in for hours and hours, and just enough votes came in to elect Kennedy. That 10,000 votes made the difference as to who won the election, and Nixon supporters to this day say the election was stolen. Then he decided 2 years later to run for governor of California against Governor Pat Brown. You might know that Jerry Brown is the present governor of California. It was his dad. I met Pat Brown, very personal guy, much more personal than his son. And Pat Brown was somewhat of an underdog, controversial governor, but he beat Richard Nixon. Now, Nixon told reporters, look, I lost for president, I lost for governor. You're not going to have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore. A very famous statement. But as this is 1962, as 63 and 64 went along, the Republicans were looking for a nominee, and the Nixon forces decided maybe it was his time to even think about running again for the second time for president. Just on a whim, having heard these rumors, I wrote a letter to Richard Nixon, had an address at his office. He was a lawyer at the time, I think up in Philadelphia. And I had a friend that told me he was there, and I just said, would you come to Tulane and speak? Never thinking at all he'd actually show up. But lo and behold, that he accepted. His staff coordinated with me, and we had Nixon come down to Tulane University, a packed auditorium, heard him speak. I had the great pleasure of having lunch with him. And then we visited for a good while, asked me my plans. Was a very interesting guy. Humor, funny. You don't think of Richard Nixon as being funny. He was had good sense of humor and very presidential, in my opinion. I introduced him at a roaring lecture at Tulane University. Then he invited me for dinner with my wife-to-be and him that evening with his wife, Pat. Governor Dave Treen turned in to be a future governor of Louisiana, joined us, and we had dinner that evening. And after the dinner, one of his aides came over and said the president, or the vice president, that was his title at the time, wonders if you might be interested in coming to New Hampshire after you get out of law school and heading up a young person's movement for Nixon for president. I was very tempted. I liked the guy. But I was soon to be married. I had a chance to be a lawyer in New Orleans, and I passed on that opportunity. That was the first time I met Nixon. Years went on. He's elected president. It is 1974. Alan Elder, a stalwart in the U.S. Senate, our U.S. Senator in Louisiana, dies while he's running for re-election for office, quite frankly. It led to Senator Bennett Johnson being elected as U.S. Senator. And so when he died, President Nixon came down to the funeral. It was down in Houma, Louisiana. Now, I went down just on a whim. I didn't have any official invitation. I went down. Big barriers all around, about 1,000 people lined up to see the president, the vice president, and all the dignitaries coming down to Senator Elder's funeral. Well, I got up to the barriers, and I felt I was just going to stand there and see the crowd came in. Senator Claude Duval, the local state senator, who served with me at the time in the state senate, little did I know was in charge of all of the funeral arrangements. He walked across in front of the gate, and I said, "Hey, Claude, hey, Senator." He recognized me. He says, "Come here, Jim." And he slips me in the barriers and takes me into the church. Now, nobody's in the church at the time because nobody had arrived yet. I sit down right in one of the center pews, and Claude says, "Sit here, you're fine. I want to look after you." Always remembered great friendship of Claude Duval and him doing that for me. Well, 30 minutes goes by, and all the dignitaries come in. Richard Nixon sits directly in front of me. And he turned around, and I said, "Mr. President, I'm Jim Brown. You may not remember it, but I invited you to Tulane University back in 1966. He said, "Well, sure, I remember, Jim," and we visited for a while there. Very nice conversation. Told me of his love for Louisiana. Told me that I made a real mistake not coming up to join him in New Hampshire and maybe being in the White House. Well, as it turns out with Watergate, maybe it wasn't a mistake after all. In any event, those are my two meetings with the president. Interesting guy, someone that tried his best to renew his reputation by writing about foreign policy primarily after he got out of office. But, of course, Watergate stained his reputation forever. So read my column this week on Richard Nixon, and I hope you'll enjoy it. We'll be right back.